didn't go to this story because I was interested in corruption and interested in healthcare and looking for a way to tell that story. I was interested in this family. I met them first, and they compelled me and thrilled me, and I was really fascinated by the questions that they have to answer on a daily basis. And that then led me to corruption and healthcare and these kind of much bigger questions that give the film weight and meaning, not just in Mexico, but globally. But the starting point was the characters.
You could discuss the rapport with the family. Obviously, there has to be a trust level. You're potentially put into situations where they have to be protective of you. I was wondering about the dependency you have on your protagonists, because you are put in situations where you could be potentially in a legal jeopardy in a way. So there has to be a trust level that goes beyond just you filming these subjects. They have to like incorporate you
into their
risky
everyday
risky. So how was it building that rapport over that long period of time?
It was a long period of time, and I didn't show up and start, filming the scenes that you see in the film in the first week. It took honestly 3 years before I was in the spaces that you see in the film. This really crazy thing happened with the project where we had a finished cut at the end of 2017, submitted to Sundance, and didn't get in. And my producer called me when we got that news, and he was like, I think we have a good film here, but is it really the film that you wanted to make from the beginning? So I kind of thought about that for a few days, and we ultimately decided to go back and continue shooting. And in this last 2-week period, despite having filmed for the previous 3 years, I shot about 75% of the film. And I think it had taken that long to finally get the trust and the connection with the Ochoa family to be robust and strong enough to really hold up the intimacy that the film needed. And so there's all this other footage that is interesting and tells a certain story, but it's not as close and not as kind of intertwined with their life. But to answer the other part of your question is I needed to convince them that having me around was more interesting than not having me around. The only reason that they agreed to it was because we liked being with each other. And that is something that I'm actually writing about right now for another article, is the kind of process of building trust, and that, thinking about that as its own craft. As a documentary filmmaker, what I spend most of my time thinking about and worrying about is the connection with the people that I'm filming. And with this project in particular, it was, a lot of work to convince them and to show them that I was reliable and that I was gonna kind of deal with this footage in a way that felt right.
And responsible.
Yeah.
Because you are delving into personal issues that they normally wouldn't care to share. I mean, the father, like, not a failed patriarch, but somebody who hasn't figured out how to go about life, and then his son just wants something better for the whole family unit. That dichotomy is, it was a position of vulnerability on their part.
I think in a strange way, the kind of protagonists of a documentary are at far greater risk when the connection isn't real. The filmmaker quickly needs to come up with ways to create compelling characters when the footage doesn't deliver it. But when the connection is real and you really are filming them at their most vulnerable and human moments, the edit of the film in some ways becomes a lot simpler. And that is what I experienced with this project. We were kind of trying to force a story that we didn't have the material to convey in a way that felt real and felt gripping, and it took that last shoot to get there.
And I was thinking of Michael Snow films and how he kept on reappraising the mounts and the viewpoints, and I was thinking a lot about space confinement. The first thing I when I just met you, I was looking at your, I was looking at your stance, and I'm like, how did he fit in this? This thing is life and death situations, were you then framing your camera in a different way with time away from the project?
I was thinking very visually the whole process. One of the big things that interested me in this subject matter was how visual it was, and how the kind of neon lights and the nighttime landscape of Mexico City, kind of what that gave me as this kind of block of marble to work with. And the confinement of the ambulance itself was absolutely essential to being able to make pretty firm decisions about how I wanted to shoot the film. So, for example, I shot the whole thing on one prime lens, which in a kind of normal observational film can be kind of a death threat, you know, because characters will go to a space you've never been before and you can't get to where you need and you can't film the scene. But I knew that if I figured out how to just film inside this one ambulance, anything could come in the door as unpredictable as you could possibly imagine, and I would already know what the shot sequence would be of that scene. So I had an enormous amount of control over the film's look.
The actual the dashboard camera mount is actually, it's quite telling, because I was looking at those shots. Obviously there's the thrill aspect and all that stuff, but I was also sensing that it was perhaps where they bonded the most. There's the where they all have to be part of a transaction, the transaction aspect. There's also when they're in life-saving mode, which takes a team effort. But then there was that aspect where I said they have to battle through traffic, but I saw that as a larger thematic ideas that they have to go through all these hurdles together as one unit, and so the dead time sort of like it was fun to have that paradox where they sort of like dissipate and then they come together as one. It's almost like the Power Rangers or something like that.
Well, there's a long history of driving and cinema, and I think it's a space that has a lot of really fascinating qualities to it. And I think one of those qualities is that when you're driving, your mind kind of goes into a different, often more relaxed state, and there's a slight distraction that kind of lowers your inhibitions. You're not looking the person in the eye and talking to them, you're kind of taking in the surrounding and then speaking your mind. And I noticed that in a lot of the scenes, in the slower scenes where they were just cruising around the city, I would just put the camera on and record, and they would start talking about all sorts of stuff. And those were these like really reflective moments that were really important, especially just after something dramatic had happened. Those were really important moments to film. There's that one line in the film that I think is one of the most important bits, where Juan says like, this city would be totally fucked without us. And that had happened just after an accident. They were driving away into the night. And there's something about that kind of, you know, emotional state of just being behind the wheel that opens up your brain a little bit.
But when you have a mic'd up subject off camera, I got a sense that there's it really taps into an uncensored truth. I was wondering if you could discuss that mechanism to the film. Why was that important for you to delve into more complicated matters,
like off-screen conversations?
Yeah.
It's interesting. With the police officers, there's a few scenes in the film where you hear conversations about bribes kind of taking place, and some of those were scenes that I filmed, you know, very close up in the police car, and I actually decided to pull back and not show what was happening, but have it be much more distant. And I just felt like the emotional quality of hiding it a bit more from the viewer was much more interesting to watch, and gave you a much more real sense of how these kind of negotiations went down. Then there's also payments with patients, which are these unbelievably uncomfortable moments in the film. And a similar thing happened where I felt that putting them in the distance and making them a bit private and not letting the audience fully participate but kind of eavesdrop had a really potent feel to it. Those were conversations that sometimes I wasn't able to film, and so all I had was audio. But in hindsight, I don't think I would have wanted to be there with the camera. I think letting it happen on its own worked really, really well. And I'm not sure I would have been smart enough as a filmmaker to kind of make that decision. I think the kind of cinema gods handed me the right material to work with.
Happy accidents. I've been sharing this film with audiences since Sundance. Of course, not every country has government institutions that are working. Going back to the moral and ethical issues, I know that you did a screening in Mexico City, which is probably a whole other reality. But I was thinking of countries also where the negotiation between institution, like
it's a good question. In Mexico, the film lands much more like a dark comedy than it does in Denmark, for example, or Hong Kong, or really anywhere in Europe. I'm curious to see how it lands here in Montreal. I think in the U.S., people have maybe a visceral sense to healthcare dysfunction in a way that is closer to Mexico than a lot of people imagine. I had a doctor come up to me after screening in New York City and told me that in his emergency room they're making decisions about people's well-being based on their budget and their need to kind of stay above the line. And that's really what the Ochoas are doing.
Yeah.
So it's been what I really feel as a filmmaker is some cultures are much more hungry for firm answers, and some are more comfortable with ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a Q&A, I'll get either questions about, how the film was made and certain kind of subtleties, like, off-screen, on-screen dialogue, and then in some countries it will just be like, do they have medical training? Like, how far was the hospital from the patient? Just like really wanting firm answers. And that's been kind of an interesting cultural journey of like types of people that are super uncomfortable with things being a little bit unresolved.
I won't ask you what your next project is because that's the most annoying question. But I'll ask you where your curiosity lies.
Yeah.
Having spent you're probably now you're getting ready for the theatrical release of the film. So are there themes that you want to examine? Is there perhaps a different style that you'd like to touch?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the cinema of nonfiction filmmaking. And I know that sounds maybe a bit basic, but I feel like all of the tools that fiction filmmakers have been using since really cinema began haven't fully been explored in nonfiction film. And so with my next project, I'm trying to take some of the tools that I learned with Midnight Family and bringing them to an even bigger scale, and hoping to do kind of an IMAX verite film that feels like edge of your seat, high octane experience.
Okay. Hey, this is Eric from MyOnCinema.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.